Hello, welcome back. And continue reading this. Don't like it, don't watch it. Well, anyways, it soon became clear that Coffin's chaplaincy was going to be forceful and unpredictable. Although he had been a member as a Yale undergraduate of the highly prestigious Skull and Bones secret society, Coffin as chaplain strongly opposed fraternities and secret societies because of their racially, ethnically, and religiously restrictive membership. Off campus in 1961, he was arrested at one of the first sit-ins in Montgomery, Alabama. 2 years later, he was arrested again, this time for protesting segregation at an amusement park outside Baltimore. And in 1964, he went to jail in St. Augustine, Florida for participating in yet another civil rights demonstration. As Coffin moved into militant anti-war protests in 1966, his bearing and speaking skills soon made him a national figure. He has perhaps been best described by Norman Mailer in The Armies of the Night. On an October afternoon last year in Washington, Coffin and others confronted members of the Justice Department, handing them 944 draft cards returned by young men who had refused to serve in the Vietnam War. The Yale chaplain, Mailer recalled, had one of those faces you expected to see on the cover of Time or Fortune, there as a candidate for Young Executive of the Year. He had that same flint of the eye, single-mindedness and purpose, courage to bear responsibility, that same hard humor about the details in the program under consideration, the same suggestion of an absolute lack of humor once the line which enclosed his true wasp temper had been breached. He was one full example of the masculine principle at work in the cloth. These tough-minded qualities are impressively evident in the following conversation with Nat Hentoff, the most outspoken and extensive interview ever granted by Yale's embattled chaplain. Coffin met me at the railroad station in New Haven, reports Hentoff. Tall and limber, he is one of the most informal public figures I know. This ease of manner, like the dryness of his wit, is part of an integral style that helps explain why no generation barrier exists between him and the young. Wearing a blue sports shirt, red tie, and slacks, Coffin was escorting me to his car when a middle-aged lady stopped him. "You don't know me," she said, "but I just wanted to tell you that you're one of the reasons I'm beginning to have hope for the world." As we drove off the short distance to Yale, Coffin said, "Attitudes are changing more and more. There's a big Italian butcher near here. A hawk, I guess you'd say. Last week he stopped me in his store near those huge meat hooks. As he loomed over me, I wondered, is he going to pick me up and impale me?" Coffin laughed. What he said was, "Reverend, I'm beginning to see your point." The chaplain and I talked all day and into the night. Whenever we were outside on the campus, he was frequently stopped by students, some with a problem, one to ask if he'd officiate at his wedding, others just because they digged speaking with him. Late in the afternoon, the interview was interrupted as Coffin met with several students planning a ceremony on campus at which more draft cards would be turned in, but not burned. Coffin was asked to speak and predictably agreed. Later we continued talking at his small, comfortable, unpretentious house nearby, where I met his 3 young children, 2 boys and a girl, and his wife, Eva, daughter of pianist Arthur Rubinstein. After that day and night at Yale, I talked to Coffin again following Lyndon Johnson's announcement that he would not run again and that he would begin negotiations with North Vietnam. Coffin was preparing a speech for an anti-war demonstration at the time. It was in part an answer to the call from the President for Americans to now close ranks. Coffin read me his reply. The war is still going on. The plea to close ranks is a plea to close our eyes and hearts to the continuing suffering of the Vietnamese, let alone our own boys. It is a plea for spiritual death to which we can only respond. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. I begin the interview by asking him to assess the significance of Johnson's new political posture in pragmatic rather than poetic terms. Here we go. Playboy's asking here, hasn't the cutting edge of the peace movement been dulled by the negotiations with North Vietnam and by the president's refusal to seek another term of office? Far from it. Though we're now in a most hopeful period, it's also a most dangerous period. It would be a catastrophe if we didn't remain alert to the possibility of what can happen if negotiations break down. It's quite possible that President Johnson, robed in his new moral garb of self-abnegation, could turn to the country before the end of the year and say, "You can see I've done my best, but the enemy is clearly not serious about negotiations. So we have no choice but to resume the fighting." Were he to do this, many unthinking citizens might believe he had exhausted his diplomatic resources when in fact he had hardly begun to tap them. What worries me is the fact that most Americans see our willingness to negotiate as the moral issue in this war. Once Johnson agreed to negotiate, his moral standing rose again, but the basic moral issue is why we are in Vietnam in the first place. Since I believe that many Americans haven't begun to understand that, I remain very apprehensive that the killing will not stop and may well increase. Oh, I see. Dr. Spock has predicted that peace, if it comes, may be as far away as 2 years. But you've said that we can't afford to wait that long. Why not? Well, because the psychological and moral timetables demand that peace come sooner. I don't think people at home and around the world can sit around just waiting for 2 years. If talks drag on that long, the situation is bound to deteriorate. And if it does, that could mean a much more intense escalation of the war. Oh. What course do you think the negotiations should take to prevent that from happening? Well, I've always tried to make a distinction between intent and implementation. Were the American government to show a genuine intent to extricate itself, I would be inclined to leave a considerable latitude in the realm of implementation of that intent. A convincing disclosure of that intent will be crucial in negotiations. We desperately need reconciliation with the North Vietnamese and with the National Liberation Front. Hanoi in the past has said that once America really decided to move out, the path would be strewn with roses. I would hope that if Johnson does show a clear intent to get out, the National Liberation Front will make a similar statement. What do you think should be the terms of an equitable settlement? Well, clearly, the Saigon government will have to change, and that means at least a coalition government with the National Liberation Front. In the past, it might have been possible to have had a non-communist coalition in the South with the Buddhist and other forces represented, but it's too late for that now. We could have negotiated with the British in 1777 if they had offered to negotiate, probably something like 6.5 colonies for them and 6.5 colonies for us, but by 1780 it was too late. It is now 1780 in Vietnam. What if the present Saigon government refuses to accept a coalition government with a National Liberation Front? Oh, then they'll have to go it alone, and that means really alone. There's also the possibility that our own administration will persist in its refusal to consider the possibility of a coalition government. What if it remains adamant on that point? In that case, negotiations will probably break down and the war escalate again. And if that happens, our resistance to the war will also have to increase. Even if both sides consent to a coalition government, do you agree with those who feel that the U.S. has a responsibility to prevent mass executions of those whom we've supported? Well, yes, I do. The likelihood of bloodshed is real after 22 years of bitter conflict, so I would like the strongest possible international presence there after the settlement, but perhaps not the UN. A beefed-up International Control Commission, for example, would probably be more acceptable to North Vietnam than the United Nations peacekeeping force. Since North Vietnam is not a member of the UN, if we had this kind of international umbrella for a time, the United States could withdraw its troops while the international presence acted as a force against mass bloodshed. The big cats the Kais, the Theas would get out. They always do. It's the little kittens who get left behind that are vulnerable. But if an international presence remains during the transition period, the little ones can be protected. And as this is going on, the North Vietnamese can be removing their own troops. Even if they do, and even if bloodshed is avoided, what if the NLF proves to be so powerful that South Vietnam eventually goes communist? Well, that's a possibility we have to face, but that doesn't mean a unified communist Vietnam would then automatically come under Chinese control. There's very indication that Ho Chi Minh would want the Chinese communists in Vietnam any more than he wants us there. Every time there's a communist conference in Moscow, that Peking boycotts the North Vietnam delegation turns up, closely followed by the North Korean delegation. This clearly indicates that China is not able to control even communist countries in Asia. We have to remember that communism keeps changing. There is a vast difference now among Polish pink and Russian red and Chinese crimson. And look at what's been going on in Czechoslovakia this year. What an irony that when a Czech Stalinist general defeated, he defected to America. How are the Czechs possibly going to get the lid back on those students again? In Yugoslavia, after Tito, we may have even have two-party communist system. We have had to bide our time. We have to realize that enemy number one is nuclear warfare, not the communist, and enemy number two is poverty. The real struggle in this world is not east-west or communist-capitalist. It's the rich against the poor. That's why our priorities ought to be not in containing communism, nor in increasing our nuclear arsenal, but in helping the underdeveloped countries. That's our self-defense. It's absolutely ridiculous to say that we need South Vietnam to be under some kind of American control as a means of ensuring America's national security. Nor, in all likelihood, would a unified Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh be any more of a danger to us than Yugoslavia now is. As a matter of fact, a unified Vietnam could become an Asian Yugoslavia. Okay. In view of America's total military commitment to preventing Ho Chi Minh from winning the war, Hawks argues that a communist Vietnam, Yugoslavian in orientation or not, would be an immeasurable blow to U.S. prestige. Do you see any validity in that view? Well, that kind of thinking leads to the perfectly immoral position that life is expendable but prestige is not. In any case, what creates prestige? Does it stem from the naked use of power or from the legitimate exercise of authority and responsibility? Despite the fact that the French had to pull out of Algeria and out of Indochina before that, I think it's clear that they haven't lost face. In fact, they've regained a great deal of influence as well as prestige in both those areas. The sincerity of America's international commitments is already questioned, but not because we failed to save corrupt anti-communist regimes from red aggression. Our sincerity is questioned abroad because we have reneged on our commitments of economic aid to eradicate poverty, illiteracy, and disease throughout the world. Our sincerity is questioned because we're not really dealing with racism and poverty at home. It is in these areas of commitment that we have to prove ourselves. Do you think it's fair to accuse this country of reneging its responsibilities to help eradicate world poverty, illiteracy, and disease when it's already spending more than $3 billion a year on foreign economic aid? Completely fair. I know that sounds like a lot of money, but when you divide it up among the billions of people who desperately need it, that comes to about $1 apiece, and most of them never get it anyway. Much of the public economic aid and most of the private investments we've extended abroad have deterred rather than advanced the cause of social reform in the unprivileged nations. By that I mean we have not been nearly careful enough to see that our aid is actually used for education and health. For example, rather than to prop up those in economic and political power, it's well documented that much of our aid is siphoned off at the top before what is left, if any, trickles down to the masses of people. What do you suggest to remedy the situation? For one thing, if a government is corrupt and tied in with monopolistic economic interests, we should refuse it military aid. That would give such a government a real incentive to bring about reforms, since it would not be able to suppress dissent by force of arms. Couldn't that country easily acquire arms from some source other than the U.S.? Well, the only country besides ours that can supply large quantities of arms is Russia. And if Russia were to support such a reactionary and oppressive government in this way, which I consider unlikely, it would clearly be an ideological victory for us. But suppose that government were to fall as a result of our non-support. In that case, there might well be a new government that really had the loyalty of most of its people. Once that might be more deserving of economic aid, because its very existence would be predicted on an acknowledgement of the need for internal economic and social reform. Many critics of American foreign policy feel that the U.S. should give no military aid to any government, regardless of how democratic it may be. You seem to disagree. It depends on the individual case, but rather than give military aid unilaterally to any single government, I think we should concentrate on creating international peacekeeping forces under the direction and control of the United Nations. It can well be said that America passed from isolationism to interventionism without passing through internationalism, without realizing that in the world as it is today, a multinational body must be the one to decide if intervention is necessary to keep the peace. But it's not too late to do that even now. By making military arms and power international, we could avoid, for instance, the type of arms race that's going on now in the Middle East. We could avoid the situation we had when we armed India and Pakistan to forestall Chinese invasion and Russian influence. And then, when those two countries started fighting each other, it was the Russians who came in and settled the argument. America spends more than $2 billion a year on that kind of military aid and almost $30 billion more on its own war in Vietnam, both ostensibly to defend the underdeveloped nations from communism. Yet we give only the tiniest fraction of that amount, approximately 0.3% of our gross national product, to economic development abroad. That makes us one of the stingiest nations per capita on the face of the earth. This is a real indictment of Americans. It's ruthless distortion of national priorities. How can we reorder those priorities? How can we reorder those priorities? That gets to the question of personal priorities of individual Americans, which too frequently are power, prestige, and pleasure. I very much object to the way institutions take over individuals to such an extent that they not only won't extend or commit themselves, they won't even speak out. When I was in Detroit last year, I asked the reporters after a press conference, and reporters are always a great source of information for me. Who in the automotive industry is against the war? They said. Reverend, you must be joking. You don't think those bastards ever open their mouths on a controversial issue, do you? That's what really gets me. I know many businessmen who secretly have opposed the war, yet they have allowed their rights of citizenship to be bought out by the government, contracts, or by fear of pressure of one type of another or another. To make a very bitter remark, most American businessmen are such practicing cowards when it comes to controversial issues that they make common integrity look like courage. It's a dreadful commentary on the country when the peace movement is symbolized by baby doctors and chaplains. The business of America is business, we've been told. All right, then let businessmen assume their responsibilities in controversial areas and as well. I think it's awful the way people go blander and blander. The result is that we have, if not the blind leading the blind, the bland leading the bland in this country. Again and again, businessmen have asked in amazement, why are all these students out in the street? My answer to them is very simple. Because you've crawled into the woodwork. If you came out and did your duty as American citizens, there might not have to be so many students on the street. It's because of this dereliction of duty that students have become so cynical about the business community. You're not saying that businessmen are the only ones to blame? No, most Americans don't involve themselves in what needs to be done. Moreover, we are more paralyzed in thought than we know. This point was brought home to me very vividly a couple of years ago when two Soviet citizens came to visit in New Haven. They started off by asking, "How do you Americans do it?" knowing they had just returned from the Midwest. I naturally assumed they were talking about our great agricultural achievements, but they soon made it clear that they had something very different in mind. "We have watched CBS, NBC, ABC. What's the difference? We have listened to endless radio broadcasts and their monotony is absolutely breathtaking. With the exception of such newspapers as the New York Times, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Louisville Courier-Journal, your country's editorial policies, not only in the Hearst papers, but in other papers, are remarkably alike. So how do you do it? How do you achieve such a high degree of thought control without resorting to terror?" I thought to myself, this is some irony. Communists might soon be coming to our shores in droves in order to study more sophisticated methods of thought control. There certainly hasn't been anything sophisticated about the methods used to suppress dissent in this country, particularly against the Vietnam War. The techniques have ranged from economic reprisal and physical brutality to the kind of extraordinary legal pressure hypnotized by your indictment, along with Dr. Spock and 3 others, for counseling violation of the draft laws. How do you account for what's been called the war on dissent? Well, as our indictment testifies, there have certainly been conscious attempts by the federal government and other authorities to stifle dissent, though I must admit that in our case we were crowding the government a little by asking for a confrontation, but I don't know if I'd term it a war on dissent. I don't think the people in power are consciously out to do away with democratic process. It's rather that their concern for law and order has binded them to the higher priority of our constitutional right to free speech. They see in our dissent, rather than in their suppression of it, a clear and present danger to national security. This overreactive reflex is all part of our willingness to seek solutions by force. Abroad, we do it militarily. At home, with police, rather than dealing with the real social and economic causes of unrest. To what extent do you think the government has been successful in its campaign to suppress opposition to the war? So far, the campaign has been counterproductive. It's increased dissent, just as the bombing of North Vietnam strengthened rather than weakened the resolve of North Vietnamese. And in my case, the government's indictment has given dissent a kind of respectability it didn't have before. People didn't always believe us when we said we were willing to accept the legal consequences of what we were doing, but now they see that we're following the traditional legal route, and the fact that we've been indicted also elicits some sympathy for people who face a prison sentence for what seems more and more clearly a question of conscience. You said on the steps of the Department of Justice building on October 20, 1967, "The law of the land is clear. Section 12 of the National Selective Service Act declares that anyone who knowingly counsels, aids, or abets another to refuse or evade registration for service in the armed forces shall be liable to imprisonment for not more than 5 years, or a fine of $10,000, or both. We hereby publicly counsel these young men to continue in their refusal to serve in the armed forces as long as the war in Vietnam continues, and we pledge ourselves to aid and abet them in all ways we can. This means that if they are now arrested for failing to comply with a law that violates their consciences, we too must be arrested. Or, in the sight of that law, we are now as guilty as they. The government finally took you and 4 others at your word. If you're willing to go to jail for this issue of conscience, as you say, why not simply accept the penalty. That statement did not mean I abdicated my right to test the constitutionality of that law. We believe that on a number of grounds, including our free speech rights under the Free Amendment, the government's case against us doesn't hold up constitutionally. Certainly, we were prepared to be arrested. We were also prepared to test the law. If a law is unjust, one of the ways of demonstrating its injustice is to have as many arrests as possible. If you lose the case, will you appeal the decision to a higher court? Yes, it is hard to argue constitutional issues at the lower end of the judiciary. I expect we'll have to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And if you lose there, if we lose and are punished, that will point again to the perennial paradox of legality and morality. Of course, men must be concerned with what's legal, but we must be more concerned with what's right. Right in the terms of one's own informed conscience, and we have to keep in mind the occasional difference between the two. I hope we'll see the day when this country attains such a high level of democracy that any action to which a man adheres for reasons of conscience and that harms no one will be constitutionally immune from the power of the majority. Those who disagree with you argue that if everyone is allowed to determine for himself which war he'll fight and in which war he'll resist, it could lead ultimately to anarchy and to the undermining of this country's capacity for legitimate self-defense. This is an argument I hear all the time. I'll answer the second part first. I think the history of the public support for even the most dubious of wars makes it highly unlikely that people would refuse to fight when the national offense was clearly at stake. As far as the argument about anarchy is concerned, I think it's important to remember three things about draft resistance. One, it's an expression of patriotism rather than disloyalty. At least that's what motivates me, and I think that's what motivates most draft resistors. These are people who know the anguish reflected in Albert Camus' words, "I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice." 2. Draft resistance does not infringe on the civil liberties of any other person. Therefore, those who say that I'm taking the law in my own hands is like the Ku Klux Klan, or that I'm doing the same as advocating rioting, really don't see the point. Third, if you're prepared to accept the legal consequences of draft resistance, you are, in fact, supporting and not subverting the legal order. So if these 3 points are kept clearly in mind, then one can understand the spirit, even when one doesn't agree with the convictions of those who resist the draft. After all, they are in the tradition of Socrates, of Jesus, of the Quakers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and of John Woolman, who broke with Benjamin Franklin, refused to pay taxes in 1750. When Pennsylvania decided to arm against the Indians, they're also in the tradition of Thoreau, Eugene Debs, and A.J. Must. But how do you justify determining as an individual the rightness or wrongness of a particular war? What of your obligations as a citizen? The answer to that is that it's in the best American tradition not to surrender one's conscience to the state, even when that means breaking the law. As I've said before, I don't think any man ever has the right to break the law, but I do think that upon occasion every man has the duty to break the law. When the law begins to dominate rather than to serve men, far from staving off chaos, it begins to invite chaos. Fundamentally, it's only a good law, not any law that stands between man and chaos. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, yes. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, no. When a man decides to break the law, he has to ask himself how great the specific evil is that he's protesting. Have all other remedies been exhausted? Is the evil so monstrous that there is no time to exhaust what remedies remain? What will be consequences of his actions on others today and 20 years from now? Has he really done his homework about the issue at hand? And as he purged